Emma, you can take it away.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining this session and for your patience on the bit of a delayed start here. Just managing some Zoom challenges, but I think we're ready to get started. Thank you so much. Thank you for joining the Western Michigan Climate Migrant Symposium, which brings together researchers and practitioners working at the intersection of climate change, migration, and urban resilience. Over the next few days, we'll explore how communities and institutions can better support those displaced by climate-related impacts. This session, entitled Coping with Loss from Displacement, will largely explore the post-displacement context and mobility outcomes for individual migrants and movers and the communities that receive them, with case studies across numerous African countries as well as Thailand. I'll just briefly run through some of the logistics of the webinar, and then we'll move into our first presentation. I will just note that each presenter will have about 18 minutes to share their research. And then once all presenters have finished, we will then move into a question and answer session where we will take questions using the Q&A section of the Zoom. So the chat function is turned off for webinar participants, but the Q&A is where you can leave any questions that you think of during the presentations. And then we have the default setting is for participants to be muted. But if you do want to say something or speak, you will have the opportunity to do that during the Q&A session. And you can let us know that you want to speak by using the raise hand function, and we will ask you to unmute. So I will now move into introducing our first presenter, Amit Tubi, who is a geographer studying the interaction between society and the natural environment. Tubi's work in this field focuses on vulnerability and adaptation to climate change, climate migration, the climate conflict peace nexus, psychological responses to climate change, and our ability to learn from pre-modern society environment interactions to improve responses to contemporary climate change. I will pass the floor to Amit. Feel free to get started by sharing your screen whenever you are ready. Thank you so much again to everyone for being here.
Thank you. I'll just share my presentation. Okay, so thanks for the invitation, of course, for this, I think, extremely important initiative. I think for both academics and practitioners. So happy to be the first speaker, and as you can see, what I'll present about today, you can see already the title, Rural Migrants in Urban Areas, Sources of Vulnerability or Agents of Adaptive Capacity. So basically what we wanted to do in this research, and this research was conducted together with Dr. Agnes Kapinka, whose picture is shown at the bottom of the presentation. Basically, what we want to look at is the outcomes of migration in the urban destinations, where basically many migrants end up. So just to show you a quick outline of the presentation. So I'll start with a few words about climate migration research, talk about the case study, introduce the research method, present the results, only about 50% or even less of the results that we've accumulated in this study. And then I'll jump to the conclusions and say a few words about follow-up studies that we're conducting at the moment. So just kind of a really quick overview of climate migration research. I think basically we can identify two main streams if we look at climate migration research. One of them is the role of migration the role of climate as a migration driver. And this is kind of the primary focus, I think, of climate migration research. And then there's also the line of research about the outcomes of migration, mainly emphasizing migration as an adaptation and focusing on households, remittances, and livelihoods. So it's a very kind of livelihood-oriented context. It focuses on families, on households, sometimes on individuals, but mainly on the household level, which is kind of the main decision-making economic unit that it focuses on. And if you look at the insights of this research, we can see that basically it concludes that migration is mainly internal, so maybe rural to urban. It will likely increase due to climate change in the following decades. And under certain conditions, political, economic, etc., migration can be an effective adaptation strategy. It can also be maladaptive, so it can also increase the vulnerability of those who migrate. But again, focus is on those who migrate, less so on the destination areas. But a question we need to ask ourselves is, if migration increases, and we know that migration already increases because of climatic related reasons, what are the impacts on the urban destination areas? And thus far, if we look at the discourse, it's an incipient discourse. It's mainly normative positive. So there are many normative arguments about migrants being conveyors of knowledge and of different cultural ideas, etc. But there's not much of an empirical evidence to validate these arguments. Hence the research question that we pose: how do urban planners and policymakers perceive rural migrants as sources of vulnerability or agents of adaptive capacity? So basically what we want to do is have this kind of a broad overarching view of the migrants from above by those decision makers who in many ways shape the outcomes of migration of those who end up in the urban areas. So the case study we focus on is Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. It's the country's largest city. It's its main economic hub. It's prone to flooding. So basically, this is a picture from the floods of 2011, which were particularly severe. But basically, the city floods every rainy season. And there are two rainy seasons every year. So pretty much every time it rains, especially heavily, the city floods, especially the informal areas where about 80% of the population lives. Obviously, many migrants, the overwhelming majority of the migrants end up in those areas, which are informal. They don't have a lot of infrastructure, not many services, etc., etc. Everything that we know about informal areas. And obviously, Dar es Salaam is also a major migration destination. These are just two pictures of the informal areas of Dar es Salaam, very specific places, of course. So stagnant water, lots of water-related problems, even when it doesn't flood, lots of clogged up drainage channels, etc., etc. So it's really a hotspot of vulnerability in many ways. So moving to the research method, what we did is that we've conducted 37 interviews with planners and policymakers in Dar es Salaam, mainly located higher up in the planning realm of Dar es Salaam. So people who basically deal with social affairs, migration-related issues, environment-related issues, climate-related issues. So all of the people that are relevant to the research question. We've asked open and closed questions. We've asked how migration increases flooding and how it may reduce flooding or basically improve adaptive capacity that can help the city adapt to flooding. And we had closed questions, but we also had open questions that we analyzed using semantic analysis, which basically helps us identify certain meanings within the text that accumulated during the interviews. So moving to the results, and what I'm showing here again are just the selected findings. Our first question was, what is migration effects on flooding in Dar es Salaam? And if you look at the overall results, then most stakeholders think that migration is mainly negative. So it mainly exacerbates flooding. They've mentioned all kinds of aspects, which I'll show you in the next slide, but mainly resulting from unplanned expansion of the city, of the informal areas, the economic activities that migrants engage in, which produce a lot of waste, and other reasons. There are also stakeholders that mentioned that migration is mainly positive because it improves adaptive capacity, because it contributes to the economy of the city. That was the most common argument that we heard, so it's kind of a more indirect effect. And there are also stakeholders who mentioned that migration does not affect flooding, that flooding is caused because of other problems, because of bad planning, because of the lack of infrastructure, because of the lack of funds, etc. And these are just some examples of the negative effects that were mentioned. So obviously, unregulated construction and waste disposal are a huge issue in Dar es Salaam. They clog up all the drainage channels and lead to flooding. And waste management isn't too developed in many of those areas. And there's also the issue of conversion of floodplains to urban agriculture, which was an interesting point because many of the migrants, when they end up in the cities, they don't necessarily engage in urban economic activities, but they basically continue to be farmers just on the outskirts of the city, which means that they convert the natural ecosystem into fields, which increases runoff, leads to soil erosion, etc. And there are also economic activities that directly impact the drainage channels. For example, sand mining, which was often mentioned, where a lot of migrants basically mine sand from the riverbed. If you can see these mounds that are surrounded by the circle, so it basically completely alters the riverbed, leads to erosion, and leads to increased flooding in many ways. So we also asked the practitioners what actions do they propose to reduce migration's effects on flooding, the negative ones. And as we can see, they could mention more than one factor. So there's more than 37 responses altogether. And many of them, most of them mentioned the need to improve planning and policy. But a lot of them, if we look at the sub-theme, the yellow one, we see that many of them mention the need to invest in planning and enforcement. So basically a top-down perspective. If we look at the second theme, so improve urban infrastructure, it's also an infrastructural measure. The migrants aren't really included in that. But when we look at the third largest theme, then it's already oriented toward the migrants. So some of them mentioned that we should formulate migrant-oriented solutions. For example, educate them about flooding because they don't know much about it, especially in an urban context. And some of them mentioned that we should also improve their lives. So they would need to live in those informal settlements so they can build proper houses, etc., which would help us reduce the impact of flooding. Some mentioned certain options that were extreme top-down, for example, relocating migrants. They said that there's basically no other options because these are low-lying areas, so we need to relocate the migrants into other areas, even if they disagree to that. And some other stakeholders had a much broader kind of systemic perspective of migration that mentioned the need to adopt a more holistic approach and to take care of the root causes of migration. So basically, take care of the root causes that lead people to migrate in the first place from the rural areas to the urban areas, for example, providing better infrastructure in the rural areas, improving education in the rural areas, generating jobs in the rural areas, and even some of them talked about trying to reduce the population increase in those areas. So we also asked them about the potentials of migrants. So we asked, okay, if we have all these negative impacts that we can see on the ground, what are the resources and capabilities that migrants do have that the city can perhaps utilize to reduce vulnerability to flooding? And these are the answers only of 23 interviewees who identified these resources. So out of the 37 interviewees, 14 interviewees said that they do not identify any sort of potential by the migrants to reduce vulnerability. And if we look at the themes, so a lot of them mentioned, for example, labor for water channels maintenance, generating income, and therefore they can be taxed, and this can help to improve the city's tax base. If we look at this perspective, these are mainly perspectives that view the migrants as kind of an economic, physical resource, if you wish. And then we have another group of perspectives that looks, for example, at adaptation knowledge and technical and planning skills and the ability of migrants to speak to other migrants and encourage them to contribute to flood reduction. This is a different group because basically they look at migrants at the more human resources, if you wish, that migrants have. And these are resources, the blue themes that we thought that can help reduce vulnerability at the city level. And the themes that are marked in yellow are basically more relevant to the level of the communities of migrants. So we saw that migrants can perhaps teach other migrants about how to use mobility as a coping mechanism. For example, moving to other parts in the city or moving to the rural areas. So one of the interesting findings we had is that some people internally migrate within the city, which is another kind of migration that no one really speaks about when the rainy season happens. So when the rainy season happens, they move to other areas in the city. And then when it ends, they go back to the informal areas because they're cheaper, because they're closer to their employment, etc. So it's kind of a cyclical migration, but not rural-urban, but just intra-urban. They also talked about other mechanisms such as mutual assistance and all kinds of saving schemes to build resilience to flooding and some other responses as well. So these are just examples of migrants' kind of innovation and adaptation knowledge. They're quite localized, so I don't know to what extent they can be adopted at a broader city scale. But what I can say is that based on the studies that we're conducting now, we shall say a few words about in a few slides, we do see that migrants do contribute to innovation. They do come up with ideas that concern, for example, green infrastructure and other types of knowledge transfer that can perhaps make a difference at the overall city level. So we asked the stakeholders, if you identified so many measures that the city can take to reduce the negative impacts of migration on flooding and perhaps even harness the positive effects of migration to boost adaptive capacity, then who's responsible of implementing those measures? And many of them mentioned the central government, so basically the federal government. A lot of them mentioned the shared responsibility. So every member of society is responsible to reduce flooding, and that aligns with policies that exist in Dar es Salaam, that every, I think it's Saturday night, every member of every community is required to go out and pick trash and clean the environment and remove trash from the drainage channels, etc., to improve the overall environmental situation. However, only a few of them, only about 11 interviewees, identified the city as a major entity that is supposed to advance adaptation in that way. So basically, it's very, very different from the more Western discourse, if you wish, that views cities as kind of being responsible to boost climate resilience and also climate mitigation. In the Dar es Salaam context, many of the interviewees don't really see the cities as, at least not as leading entities responsible for climate adaptation, even within their own premises. So just a few conclusions to wrap up. We saw that migrants are perceived mainly as sources of vulnerability, less so as of agents of vulnerability. And a lot of that is because of the visibility of the actions that generate vulnerability to flooding. So when migrants come to the city, it's visible. When the city expands, when informal areas expand, it's visible. Their economic activities are visible. The waste they generate is visible. But there are also latent resources that we don't necessarily see on the surface, knowledge and other kinds of capacities that migrants can perhaps help with at the overall city level, or even more specifically to migrants communities. But many of these resources are, again, they're left, they require cooperation with the city, definitely to be transferred from one locality to the other within the city and to reach a much broader exploitation potential. However, even though the potential exists, we do see that many planners and policymakers don't see the role of the city as responsible for advancing adaptation and advancing a certain dialogue with the migrants. Therefore, I guess our main conclusion, which is again quite normative, is the main place that we should go from here is basically to facilitate the dialogue, to bring city people and migrants together, allow them to speak, allow them to share ideas, and in many ways allow them to interact and try to exploit the potential perhaps that migrants do bring with them. So this research led to 2 follow-up studies. One of them is basically completed. It's a paper in preparation. We still have some analysis to do, but it's basically completed, where we look at migration's effects on vulnerability and adaptive capacity at the community level. So Dar es Salaam is divided into communities, into what they call mutaz, or streets, which are basically normally like 5,000 people. And we interview the community leader, and we focus on 3 main dimensions: knowledge transfer, collective action, vis-a-vis conflict. Some of them also mentioned that migration can lead to conflict, which reduces collective action. And we also look at the migrants' contribution to economic growth, try to find kind of identify their impacts on vulnerability and adaptive capacity, but in a more localized way that is really can really perhaps see those effects more clearly rather than the overall city level. And another study that we're conducting now is basically trying to reverse the paradigm in many ways that migration is treated or is viewed by planning and policy institutions. And what we want to do is basically, instead of looking from a top-down perspective, one asks the migrants and other residents of informal areas, what do you need from the city when you arrive to the city that can help you exploit your potential to reduce flooding and help you to reduce your negative impacts on the environment. So kind of reversing the perspective in many ways. And with that, I'll end. Thank you again for this conference, this symposium, and thanks for inviting me. And yeah, I'll end with a few pictures from Dar es Salaam. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tooby. That was extremely interesting. And maybe I'll just offer some of my reflections, but I found it found it an excellent case for discussing both the, I guess, whole of society approaches that I think are really coming out here, where the planners prefer interventions that bring in stakeholders across society rather than just at the city level. And I find it interesting that you mentioned the interventions possibly needed at the rural community level, where it's not just about improving outcomes it's not just about interventions in the city level for improving outcomes for migrants that arrive, but also across the entire migration system. So the places that they come from, the communities that they enter into. And in the absence of top-down approaches, it was great to see that, the recognition that people still have to exist with the flood and that they're going to innovate in order to survive and control the flood waters around them, even without official flood management infrastructure. So I think with that, we'll move to our next speaker, and I will now introduce Dr. Diogo Seraglio, who is a research analyst at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. His research focuses on advancing the understanding and the management of the interplay between the impacts of climate change and immobility patterns. So, Dr. Seraglio, it's over to you for your presentation. Thank you.
So much. Can you hear me? I will quickly share my screen. Can you see my screen?
Yes, thanks.
Perfect. So good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Diogo Seraglio. I'm a research analyst at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, PIC in Germany. Today, here representing my colleague, Dr. Julia Blocher, who couldn't join us, unfortunately. Our presentation is titled Habitability and Human Mobility Related Loss of Social Resilience and Cohesion, Insights from 5 countries. And this work was conducted under the EU Horizon 2020 Habitable Project that ran from 2020 until last year and draws on our field research in Ghana, Kenya, Mali, Thailand, and South Africa during 2022, 2023. One second. So our main objective in this study, and this is an ongoing work in progress, we are still working on the analysis, is to examine how climate-related changes influence social resilience and cohesion within affected communities, with a particular focus on the role of migration, both as a coping strategy and a factor that can deepen social inequalities. Among research questions, we are trying to understand how do environmental and climatic stressors affect the social resilience of communities facing livelihood disruptions. In which ways does migration contribute to strengthening or undermining social cohesion in these contexts? And how do differences in access to migration and related resources shape inequalities and social differentiation within and between communities? And here, as part of the introduction, we define habitability as a community's ability to support people in its social and natural environment. We all know that there's an active debate about whether climate change can force large groups to leave their homes permanently. And most research looks only at the physical tipping points like floods or sea level rise and ignores the social side of the story. So um, our goal here is try to fill this gap by looking at how migration caused by climate shocks affects community cohesion and resilience. Um, in this slide, so we begin with our conceptual framework and a quick look at the current state of the research, which also highlights why this study matters. So even when people face the same climate shocks, such as droughts, floods, and heat waves, the choice to migrate varies widely within a community. So these decisions, we all know that they are shaped by a mix of social, economic, and cultural factors that are different from household to household. Um, our work aims to show that people's sense of a place becoming uninhabitable isn't driven solely or only by physical changes. Social and structure factors such as access to resources, community support, and even local power dynamics also play a role when and why households decide to leave. As more people view their homes as less livable, we see migration rates rising. So this shift has both positive and negative effects on the resilience of the entire community. And because family and neighbors rely on each other when one household reaches its adaptation limit, it also it can send ripple effects through the rest of the village. So these are the interconnections that we aim to discuss and show a little bit in the next few minutes. So here also related to our conceptual framework and habitability and migration tipping points, we all know that stronger floods, storms, and droughts are making some places literally uninhabitable. And while many scholars warn that these extremes will drive people from their homes around the world, real experience also show that we can't simply predict habitability thresholds at large geographic scale. So we understand habitability with three dimensions. Physical conditions, these are physical conditions, livelihood, sustainability, and social resilience. And today we focus on the third one, social resilience, that is defined by Neil Edger. Um, is a community's ability to withstand shocks and stresses without crossing a point where it can no longer function. So it depends on the strength of local livelihoods, access to resources, and the quality of social institutions. In our project, we always treated social resilience as an interdisciplinary concept. So strongly institutions are fueled by shared cultural practices, a unified worldview, and deep emotional bonds among community members. And we apply this lens in our five study areas to understand how these social factors set real limits on a community and its capacities to adapt. Um, Still on our conceptual framework, our interviews show us that when people begin to feel their community is no longer livable, they are more likely to migrate over time. and that migration then has mixed effects on social resilience. We understand that both financial remittances and new ideas or social remittances can strengthen resources and solidarity, but losing family members and neighbors can, on the other hand, weaken local institutions and support networks. In this context, we understand that climate change acts as an external shock that affects every household and raises shared concerns about habitability. So these factors, they ended up feeding back on one another as more people leave because they see their homes becoming uninhabitable, social cohesion erodes further, making the place even less livable. So if these cycles continue unchecked, it can spiral downward until migration becomes the only realistic choice for a critical mass of residents. So here some information about our data and methods. We used a two-cycle coding process to analyze semi-structured interviews, both content and sentiment-wise. These study sites were chosen using the Habitable Project wide criteria, and we applied a mix of critical case and snowball sampling. Between 2022 and 23, we conducted over 600 interviews in, o- in origin areas across 5 primary countries. These are Ethiopia, Ghana, Kenya, Mali, and Thailand, and one secondary case country, South Africa. Um, we also conducted interviews in destination areas, usually capital cities, where we carried around 100 interviews, and we also had the chance to get further information with community leaders. So going to the results or like to our an overview of what we have been doing to understand um, the loss of social resilience and social cohesion. We first bring here an overview of subjective well-being and wealth. Um, and we see that participants generally reported a stable or declining well-being over the past decade, very often citing droughts and crop failures as reason for decreased well-being. Combined with this subjective well-being and wealth, we noticed, for instance, that in Ghana and in Kenya, over 70% of respondents considered themselves poor or very poor, while in Mali and Thailand, this was a little bit more moderate. We also found that unequal government and NGO aid distribution ends up fostering mistrust, which undermines both social cohesion and individual perceptions of fairness. So here, when we look at individual and household well-being, most participants expressed a pessimistic view of recent changes, at least in every sub-Saharan African country we studied. Those reporting stable or declining subjective well-being far outnumbered those who felt their well-being had improved. And when interviewees explained why their well-being was falling, they mentioned a few main reasons that you can see here in this figure. Um, so we can see that many lost their jobs or saw their crops failing. But what we see overall is that changing economic and environmental conditions made everyday life tougher. Um, so they said that social ties were fraying. Neighbors who once helped each other now compete for limited resources, which also leads to jealousy and weakened community support. Um, on this slide, we bring some information on migration impacts and what are, according to the respondents, some positive and negative aspects of migration. On the positive side, of course, we hear a lot about remittances helping families to buy food, pay expenses, improve farming practices, with skills that are shared by returnees. On the other hand, on the negative side, migration drains local labor, forcing costly hires, and weakens community bonds, since phone calls can't replace in-person support, right? Um, and also, when we were now analyzing like these positive and negative aspects of migration and migration impacts, what we have noticed is that social resilience and how people feel about their community can, how they feel about their community can remain livable, changes in different ways when people move. So first, migration can weaken local ties. So when a family member leave, the community lose the social connection that support cultural identity, networks, and even shared resource management. So in rural agricultural areas, breaking these social institutions can make communities even more vulnerable to climate related stresses. On the other hand, we all know that migration can also foster resilience. So sending a family member away often creates a social contract in which the migrant's financial remittances help the household cover basic needs. Also, returnees bring back social remittances, that is, new skills, knowledge, and ideas that also support to improve livelihoods and community bonds. So in this way, social resilience sits on a spectrum in which, when combined with migration, um, and in this regard, migration both erodes and builds social resilience over time, shaping how communities cope with the external shocks. In this slide, we want just to bring some quick information about the ability to prepare and plan, or basically answer the question, is migration among preferred local level coping strategies? And what we see here is that the interviewees in the origin areas reported that most adaptation strategies had first mixed success. Um, in Ghana, around 35 interviews out of 140 felt their measures worked, compared to around 70 in Mali, and fewer than 30 in Kenya. And what we see, or the message that we want to bring here, is that in the past, support from neighbors and relatives was seen as very helpful. But many have noted that community backing has declined over time. Across all sites, migration was rarely planned in advance. Instead, people turned to it after other strategies failed. When looking back, however, in previous adaptation strategies, we see that labor migration very often ranks among the top past responses, second only to changing farming methods or using savings or even relying on stored food. This was not the case in Mali, where we noticed a clear situation, a clear scenario of maladaptation, um, where migrants would get low wages in at destination areas, and they wouldn't be able to send remittances back. But overall, our evidence shows that most response strategies, including migration, are shaped by trial and error. So while migration can sometimes be effective, at least in our sample, it is usually a reactive measure rather than a proactive one. Um, just some reflections and also some next steps for this research. Um, it was clear, or it is clear from our sample that no community is yet fully uninhabitable. But on the other hand, it is very clear that climate shocks are wearing down livelihoods and well-being. So uneven support can spark local tensions, and only wealthier families can tap into migration and remittances to adapt. So that deepens inequalities within communities. We are further investigating and analyzing our data to further support the idea that migration both erodes social capital and builds it through remittances. Um, so here we have again some the information that migration can support sustained habitability or like positive aspects. And on the other hand, migration has also downsides by decreasing social resilience. And again, maybe my main message here is that isn't just about the physical conditions. Social resilience matters too. While we haven't seen mass climate-driven human mobility, migration, or displacement yet, perceptions of livability are falling. So going forward, tracking social cohesion and adaptation over time will help us to understand how migration shapes community resilience. I thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take your questions in the Q&A session. Thank you so much, and I hand over to you, Emma.
Thank you so much, Dr. Seraglio. A really interesting presentation and a very important contribution to the field of habitability research. And it's really interesting to see the expansion of the habitability concept to move beyond questions around the physical limits of spaces and places to include a more comprehensive perspective on what makes a place habitable from a social perspective, as well as the various ways in which mobility and migration have added to or taken away from the resilience on more of an individual scale for those that have moved in the countries that you did your research. So thank you so much. And with that, we'll move to our third presenter, Ms. Claire Steiner, who is a research associate in gender, environment, and development at SCI Asia. Her research focuses on the interactions of environmental and climate change, migration and human mobility, gender and social equity, and resource contestation with a focus on Asia and the Pacific. So without further ado, I'll pass it over to Claire for her presentation. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Emma, for the introduction. Let me just share my screen real quick. Okay, and hopefully now you can see it. Sorry, that took me a minute. I changed the title slightly from what you might see in the program, but more generally, it's a presentation based on a study that we had been conducting over the last year that's focused on climate and mobility justice, particularly under transboundary hydropower, with some evidence that I'll be presenting from northeastern Thailand. Okay, so just a quick introduction. So as it was described in the opening sessions, climate mobility is often illustrate severe global injustice, right? Those who are most affected are often the ones who are least responsible for emissions. However, as Diogo has just presented on, a lot of the research seems to be focused largely on household adaptation, in particular to the biophysical climate impacts. Often this leads to overlooking some injustices that are generated, whether it's the social and cultural injustices that Diogo and others have just presented on, but also some of the injustices that might be generated by how we go about climate mitigation and adaptation projects themselves. And so there's a lot of emerging feminist and critical work that's trying to reframe mobilities as an issue of justice, but the empirical applications still remain limited. And so this study was kind of building on this foundation to try to apply Nancy Fraser's work, who is a famous justice theorist, and her three-dimensional justice framework to kind of understand how first some large-scale hydropower projects might be shaping mobilities focused here in Thailand, as well as how these mobilities might be reflecting and or reproducing existing structural injustices. And then we really wanted to understand how affected communities might be exercising agency under these conditions, no matter how constrained, whether that's through adaptation, resistance, and contestation. So that's a little bit of an overview on what I'll be presenting on. So as I just mentioned, there's this kind of growing justice turn in some of the climate mobilities literature, especially some of the more critical scholarship that's trying to move beyond this more outdated climate refugees framing, which tends to treat people from the global south especially as a monolith, but also to resist some of this more neoliberal framing of thinking about migration just as adaptation as an individual responsibility towards thinking more about a structural justice perspective. And so some growing work in climate mobility justice as emphasizing the responsibilities of wealthier states and major polluters, right, to reduce emissions and also halt and reduce and mitigate and restore relations related to extractive development, historic and ongoing. In the context of migration, it's calling for treating climate-affected communities with dignity and respect, and also recognizing both their rights to move, but also the rights to stay. And so a lot of this movement is also coming from a growing turn towards looking at issues of immobility, a lot of which is also coming from the Pacific. Okay, so just to briefly introduce the analytical lens that we'll be looking some of the evidence through. So Nancy Fraser's three-dimensional justice framework. So first to start off with a bit of a definition, because there's many different ways to think about justice within the field. But the way that she defines it is justice as a parity of participation, meaning that it is just when all social actors can interact with one another as equals. She defines three different domains in which you can look at justice and injustice. First, economic injustice, in which she defines that there is a maldistribution of economic resources and benefits, which is contributing towards injustice. And so justice in this context would then mean a redistribution of resources to be more equitable. The second domain is a cultural and symbolic injustice. And so this has to do with the status inequality, discrimination when it comes to thinking about values and belief systems, but also just like a misrecognition of knowledge that comes from having a status hierarchy. And so then the way to remedy this would be in improving recognition, she says. Then lastly, on political injustice, this has more to do with the issues of membership, of procedure and boundary. So she's also writing this in the context of globalization, where she's talking about how the global challenges are increasingly beyond the territorial border as we see, and thus it demands a reframing of thinking about political membership and representation. And so in this, she imagines then the remedy to be representation. And in talking about this, even though they're three conceptually distinct categories, they're often interwoven in ways that result in what she calls a vicious circle in which the three orders of injustice often reinforce one another. And so thinking about this framework and keeping it in mind, I first want to situate the study a little bit into the regional history of thinking about mobility and also thinking about justice in northeastern Thailand, especially for those who may not be so familiar. And so if you look at the diagram on the screen, northeastern Thailand is the area that you'll see here in purple, which is bordering primarily Laos and also Cambodia. And especially since the 1970s, when Thailand was undergoing rapid development, migration started to expand a lot, both internationally, which was primarily to the Middle East to work in oil and agriculture, and also in East Asia to work in domestic work, construction, agriculture, but also then domestically, especially to cities within the central region, which you see in yellow here, primarily to Bangkok, which is closer to the Gulf in the south there. So this kind of movement is very common, and it's become more and more circular and also quite gender balanced. And so many households in the Northeast rely on remittances, primarily from young adults who are moving for a period in their lives, maybe a few years, and then eventually they'll resettle back down in the Northeast. And this is a common way that they've been sustaining their household for decades now. Within the last few decades, around the same time in the 70s, development has largely centered on investment within Bangkok. So a lot of the state investment has been focused there, which has created conditions under which existing wage inequalities are becoming like deepened. While also there's been an increasing reliance on cash crops, particularly within the northeast of Thailand, in ways that have often left the farmers vulnerable, while also being, a poverty reduction strategy, just one that's very precarious. In addition to this kind of economic inequality, there's very significant cultural hierarchies and also unequal political influence within Thailand that continues to marginalize Northeastern communities. In particular, there's a lot of stereotype around Northeastern people being less educated, less developed, and then thus less able to sit in, say, these like spaces of governance. And then to kind of set the stage also around hydropower and Thailand's role within transboundary hydropower development. So for those of you who may not be so familiar, the Mekong River is a very large river that crosses across several different countries in Southeast Asia and China. And since the 2000s in particular, dam construction has really accelerated and kind of transformed the Mekong River into this very highly engineered watershed. Thailand is both a receiver of some of the impacts within the North and Northeast region, but it also plays a very key strategic role in financing and also importing electricity from these projects. Most notably, Shayaburi Dam, which was constructed in Lao PDR and then started operation in the 2018-2019. A lot of these benefits from hydropower are not necessarily going to the rural community, but rather it's often, since it's imported and concentrated then in the urban centers in Bangkok. On the other hand, the downstream communities are often the ones that are bearing the loss, whether it's through fish decline, unstable flows, and livelihood losses. And a lot of local voices remain marginalized in governance in ways that have prompted a lot of mobilization for recognition and justice within the region. And so also to kind of like set the context a bit, I'm not going to be talking about a direct displacement related to the dams, say for instance within Laos, but rather it's this like slower form of displacement that's happening that I'll be discussing. So the methods from this study, like Diogo, is kind of building off of some of the work that we were doing within the Habitable project because SCI Asia was a partner in that. But it was kind of looking also not just at the climate impacts within these areas, but trying to like tug more at understanding the perceptions of justice. And so we picked a couple of sites along Ubon Ratchathani province, which is bordering Lao PDR here, and relies on the Mekong River. It's an area that has the impacts from upstream hydropower development, but also they're experiencing a lot of slow onset environmental changes, in particular, increasingly hot temperatures because it's a very arid and dry region, and also a very unpredictable rainfall. And this also, as I mentioned, happens to be a province with a very strong legacy of environmental activism, of mobilization, particularly against injustices related to hydropower development. So in this, we conducted 28 semi-structured interviews with community members of different migration mobility statuses, whether they were people who've been immobile for decades or people that had children that were living in different areas, et cetera. And we also tried to capture people of different gender, social status, identities, et cetera. And we supplemented this with some key informant interviews, primarily with Thai civil society leaders who were documenting adverse impacts, and also through participation in some of the common grassroots conferences that they host in this province and also in Bangkok. And so within these methods, we're not necessarily trying to understand exactly what the mobility impacts are related to hydropower, having like a statistical analysis of it, but rather we're trying to understand, okay, what are the different types of injustices that are being communicated? Okay, and so this is some of the findings then that we found around livelihoods and mobilities. And so a lot of the livelihoods in the area depend on this mixed farming, fishing system. A lot of them, they were farming particularly cashews, cassava, rubber, inside of the land a bit, a few kilometers from the river. But then they often also had a riverbank garden and were reliant also on the fishing from the river. However, they described hydropower and climate change having disrupted both forms of livelihood. One, hydropower being responsible from their perspective with the loss of fish, loss of biodiversity, fluctuating levels of water within the river that were causing irregular flooding, irregular drought, but then also a lot of heat that was then causing some of their crops to fail or for it not to be as productive as normal. And just like as maybe you've seen with other types of studies too, often it's these better resource households that are able to stay and have diversified income, be able to invest in different crops. And they can also have remittances often from maybe a higher wage, like income that their children are working at. On the other hand, a lot of the poorer, more landless households are often the ones that are facing these conditions of distress migration. So migrating under maybe exploitative conditions or conditions they otherwise probably wouldn't have wanted to, or having very constrained immobility. This was particularly the case that we saw with households without land. Those were in poverty that was persistent, and also some of the households that were from Lao PDR originally, because they often were the ones that had the lowest status within the communities. So immobility in this context, it reflected both constraint, particularly with the say landless Lao households, but it also reflected deep attachment. And so there were several, especially elderly Thai people, that are talking about how staying, is a form of resistance, the fact that their identity is so closely tied to the water that they couldn't imagine going somewhere else permanently. And so I have a quote here below about this woman who was talking about her experience, that often she goes and she relies on the riverbank garden and she collects vegetables from there. It's important for her livelihood, but also for her food security. But she can't imagine going anywhere else, even though these negative impacts keep happening to her, because ultimately it's what she knows. Okay, and so just to kind of sum up some of these compounding injustices that we saw in the field. So first, there's the economic injustice, right? Hydropower development alongside climate change has kind of eroded some of the local livelihoods, and it's resulted in these conditions of deepening rural indebtedness, especially in these areas, and also increased dependence on cash crops for their livelihoods. So this is reflective of maldistribution. And then cultural injustice. And so there are several instances where they're talking about how, actually I think counter maybe to what we were talking about before, there's a lot of households here that are often living with the floods, right? And they're so used to understanding the natural patterns and the natural heartbeat, as they call it, of the river, right? But now because of climate change, because of the dams, it's disrupting these local ecological knowledge and practices. And at the same time, the ways of governing the river tend to be very technocratic in ways that often devalue some of the community expertise and the community knowledge. So this is misrecognition. And then lastly, there's a political injustice that these communities are facing. Because they are not at the exact site of the hydropower, they actually lack formal standing in transboundary governance. There was a lawsuit that they brought against the Thai Electrical Authority, but the courts ruled that in fact these downstream Thai communities are not directly impacted by hydropower and therefore are not eligible for any kind of compensation related to it. And these exclusions are also happening at multiple levels, because the ways in which compensation happens in Thailand, it's often based on, okay, you have the amount of land, and then maybe you experience flooding and drought, but you have to have the land title, right? And you have to have a certain amount in order to, qualify for this kind of compensation. So these are several layers of misrepresentation that we saw. And I think here it's important also to talk about how these dynamics are interdependent, right? So there's economic precarity that's resulting from this lost or degraded livelihood, but it's compounded by the fact that there's political misrepresentation that's foreclosing these avenues for remedy, while also contributing and legitimizing cultural misrecognition. However, it's not all, negative. I also want to really emphasize here that the local communities themselves are very active in calling for justice. And so in this context, they're talking quite a bit about maybe the investment in restorative livelihoods for the community, thinking about more equitable poverty reduction schemes that are more responsive to climate environmental impacts, that don't foreclose the ability of like people of different backgrounds, different socioeconomic statuses, and being able to access that. There was a lot of like cultural and creative activism that included a lot of storytelling, photography, film projects that are focused on reclaiming river-based identities and promoting visibility, especially in these environmental activist spaces. And then you have a quote down below from a Thai photojournalist that I had the opportunity to interview that talks about how, you know, maybe if you understand the Mekong people, you might think of them sometime. And he does these photo collections in ways that he's trying to help make this work like make the local people feel very proud of themselves, to kind of emphasize the importance of process also. And then lastly, there's a lot of Thai Ban or villagers research and knowledge sharing that's quite famous within Thailand. And within the communities that we went to go interview, they also shared how the community members, they go out daily to record the water levels, the sediment flows, and they share that information with the government, and they share that information with the other provinces. They try to record the biodiversity changes, the fish catches, and try to teach that in ways that then try to strengthen their claims when they're demanding accountability for these impacts and to show we have been affected. And then some conclusions and the future pathways. So as I kind of briefly went over here today, a lot of these climate mitigation and adaptation projects, for example, like Mekong Hydropower, are reshaping mobility in ways that maybe are unjust by undermining the material conditions of staying, and also often then channelizing marginalized households into precarious mobility or immobility. This is not anything that's a new pattern, but rather it's a reinforcement of existing marginalization within their migration trajectories. So these mobilities are both reflective, but also often are reproducing structural injustice because they're not able to get into like a higher wage opportunity, or they're facing injustices at different domains, like I explained here. So there's a need then for systematic change by redistributing benefits in ways that, you know, were mentioned before, recognizing local knowledge, ensuring adequate representation. But also I think it's very highly context specific, right? And this is why I think it's important also that future climate mobility justice pathways must center the affected communities as rights holders, but also as the knowledge producers themselves on climate action, otherwise reliable to reproduce the inequalities that we might be claiming to resolve. So that's my presentation, introducing a bit of a study. And then also, if you're interested to learn more the ways in which SCI Asia in particular talks about migration, climate change from the justice approach, feel free to check out this report that we published earlier in this year. But I'm going to hand it back to Emma now. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you so much, Claire, for that really interesting presentation. And I really appreciate you bringing in the immobility angle. I think it was really interesting to see how not only climate change, but the ways in which we respond to climate change, particularly from an infrastructural and energy perspective, can actually further exacerbate underlying drivers of both mobility and immobility, particularly when systems of support are lacking or further causing harm or injustice. So thank you for that. I will now turn it over to the question and answer segment of this webinar. So I would like to invite the audience to please submit any questions that you might have for the panelists in using the Q&A function, and we can go through those as a group. In the meantime, while people think of hopefully some questions, I wanted to open the floor for the presenters to either respond to each other or offer any reflections that you might have on each other's projects. And if there are none, that's fine. I have a few questions that I could ask of all of you to get the conversation started. But yeah, I'll give you a few minutes to comment or reflect on each other's projects if you wanted to. Does anyone have any thoughts that they would like to share?
I can perhaps share one thought. There's an interesting perspective basically came up in Claire's presentation and in Diogo's presentation, and it's also evident to some extent in the more migrant-based research that I've done before, is that there's a significant component that is often missed in the literature, and that's well-being, which is extremely important. I mean, it's kind of like an overarching indicator that is sometimes really difficult to operationalize and measure. But it's not just whether people deal with climate change per se, but what it does to them as well. And looking at Diogo's findings, it really speaks to the findings of research that I've done in Kenya, is that you can see how people's vulnerability, migrants' vulnerability kind of increased in some ways and declined in some ways, but their well-being just dramatically declined in pretty much all of the aspects that we've looked at. So I think it's a very important component that we should be looking at more in migration and vulnerability studies more generally.
Thank you very much, Dr. Amit, for your comment, and I totally agree. We always need to keep in mind that when we are working with the linkages between climate change and human mobility, everything is so contextualized. So each community has different dynamics and perceptions related to climate impacts, even migration. But that makes me think that migration decisions, maybe they are also like a kind of a continuum, right? Sometimes migration is something that pops up more clearly in a community, and sometimes, okay, we can adapt, we can have different alternatives, but it's always in the back of the mind of all these households. And depending on the context, it'll take place or not.
Maybe if I can also share some reflections. I think what was really also standing out to me is the focus really on the policymaker, right, and how they like frame this kind of issue. And for me, something that's striking across the three is that we all kind of looked at displacement quite differently. But of course, I think as we know, like if we're really thinking about displacement and then the ability to get some kind of remedy related to displacement, it takes some kind of like real definition for the policymaker to understand it. But even just in our cases, right, it's like a very complex way of thinking about displacement, whether it's like a cultural dislocation, right? Or whether it's like a maybe temporary related to flooding, or whether it's something more permanent. And so that has I think, quite interesting ramifications then for how we're thinking about possible remedy. Mm-hmm.
That actually is a great transition, Claire, to the question that I had prepared for all of you. And seeing no questions from the audience just yet, I think I'll move into that if that's okay. I would love to know, just given that this session is focused on outcomes, so really the post-movement or post-climate impact context. I would love to hear from all three of you, just from the perspectives that are included in your study, whether it's from the community member or the policymaker or the civil society actor that's working to support the community member. But what do you think is kind of, if you were to set an agenda for improving the outcomes of people that move in the context of climate change, what are some of the interventions that you would propose a lot in that agenda, and who would be the actors responsible for taking those actions? Kind of a broad question, but intentionally broad, given that you are, again, as Claire pointed out, working in such different contexts. So I'll leave it there and pass it to whoever wants to start first.
I can offer a few insights. I think it'll be much easier for me to answer this question once we complete the study that we're planning to do in Dar es Salaam, and we'll actually talk to people on the ground, to migrants. It's not just migrants, basically residents of informal settlements, so a lot of migrants, but also long-term residents, and as to their perception. And I think one of the most important things that we can do is bottom-up approaches, basically. And the problem is that in many of those environments, I think there's a very predominant top-down approach, and people see their jobs like policymakers, their job is to manage the floods, or their job is to manage the informal settlements. And that obviously often overlooks the people themselves. So finding where to meet and where to discuss these points is often a challenge. And I think in this case, perhaps this is a conjecture, not even a hypothesis, perhaps civil society organizations can make a difference as mediators between the government, official institutions, and the people. And yeah, it changes a lot from place to place, but I think people's perspectives, not just about migration and vulnerability, but basically asking broader questions of how do you want to see your lives? And that includes flooding, it includes climate, it includes vulnerability, and all those things, but it needs to embed it within a broader economic context, etc. Because if you look at basically risk management approaches, that's where they often get it wrong. They minimize the risk. So, for example, in Dar es Salaam, it was a relocation project that was a complete failure because it ignored the people. So it removed them. It completely reduced the vulnerability to slums. Sorry, but then it also basically removed them from their employment. So they just didn't move there. So talking to the people, civil society organizations, and finding the right mediators, I guess.
If I may also add to your question, and thank you very much. That's a great and very timely question. So if we think about improving outcomes, migration outcomes, and of course pushing to my presentation, we should always focus on try to rebuild social resilience or even avoid the loss of social resilience. As I was mentioning during my presentation, what we see from our sample, from the habitable semi-structured interview sample, is that migration is considered as an adaptation strategy by some interviewees. But in practice, when we ask them, like, when did you last migrated and which circumstances and etc., we see that migration is always a last resort. They will try like to adapt as much as or as many times, like during different seasons, as they can. So we really need to be it at the local level, at the community level, and see how NGOs and how local organization or community-based organizations can support um, resilience in these areas. But then, of course, also acknowledging all the capacity, the lack of capacity coming like from vertical coherence. We all have like all the challenges coming like from the national level, who always broadly acknowledge the topic. Then like the information gets lost at the regional level or state level, and the local level, people are basically forgotten. So these would be my comments to your question. Thank you.
Gosh, it's such a good question, but also such a big question to try to answer. For me, I think one thing is that I personally also have been struggling with thinking about outcomes, right? Because also, I guess maybe the context within the case study that I was presenting today, they're already highly mobile people that have been mobile for decades, right? And so it's not necessarily that they have one trigger or like multiple triggers that then contribute to one outcome. It's more like this migration dynamic, right? Where it's like maybe some people are able to go move somewhere, other people's can't for certain periods of time, etc. And so I see the importance of like trying to define a particular outcome because also, like I just mentioned before, this is kind of like where remedy comes in. But when I'm thinking about like the context of people's lives, perhaps it's a bit difficult to define like when this outcome might be. And then also from the case study that I was presenting before, like I mentioned earlier, it's not really that there was a one trigger for like displacement. And so also when I'm talking with the people there, they're talking a lot about how this is like a slow onset environmental changes, right? That are then changing their livelihood or changing the ways in which they understand like their local knowledge, right? Like they don't have the same predictability of the floods and of the droughts that they had before, which is something already that they were learning to live with. But now because it's more unpredictable, and then as I think Dr. Amit was talking about before, the response from the policymaker is to try to manage the situation. Then it kind of creates this tension. But I think, as the other two presenters mentioned before, one pathway forward that I also mentioned in my presentation is just seeing how people themselves, right, are communicating about the issue. Like another thing that's quite glaring to me, like when I talked, especially with the civil society leaders around this issue, is that they're coming from it from an environmental justice, climate justice perspective, right? They're not coming at it from a climate and migration perspective necessarily. That's not their primary focus. But it just signals that there are already such strong grassroots movements in place that then we could, connect with much strongly, or try to connect some of the migration, angle and the migration research that we do quite well, right? To attach towards like these movements that are a bit larger and wider, and can then try to communicate this and figure out ways like with us in order to communicate it with the community members themselves. I think that's a step forward.
Great. Thank you so much for those responses. I think just the thread that I see here is really, I think, going back to what we mentioned about bringing in the idea of well-being. And I think I really liked how Dr. Tooby brought up this question, or just pointed to the fact that it's sometimes also the questions that we are asking. And I really liked your question and thought it brought together the themes of all of these presentations quite well. Which is, how do you want to see your life? And, when you get the response to that question, that kind of is the indicator of the angle that you should take in providing the remedy, both from a immobility and mobility perspective. But I agree, Claire, that it's an excellent point that it's often not about a remedy at a single point in time. It can be across a longer period of time. It could be multiple remedies, or really what we're talking about are systems of support and well-integrated systems of support at different levels. So with that, I see that we're almost at time, but I know there is one other question in the chat that I would like to address before we close out. If you wanted to just give a quick, let's say, hopefully 30-second response, each of you, to the question in the chat, which is, do the speakers think that climate-induced displacement and migration can be used interchangeably in more specific scenarios? So really thinking about the terminology that we're using here, and I guess grounding that in some of the case studies that where you've actually seen these mobility dynamics play out. Not sure if anybody wants to go first.
I'll respond first. I'll keep the order of me responding first, just to keep things in order. I think they shouldn't be used interchangeably because they mean different things. I mean, displacement tends to be more forced, whereas migration perhaps tends to be more voluntary. And I think we still need to use these different terminologies to just make sure that we pay attention to the differences and to the different drivers of migration, which are often also linked with different outcomes of migration. Displacement normally tends to have worse outcomes for people who are displaced.
Yeah, so I guess it's my turn. And in general, I would say that they shouldn't be used like this way, even though they are very often linked. I come like from a legal background, so migration and displacement, like they are completely, they have different definitions of like displacement being like forced or sudden movement, and then migration, you imply a certain level of voluntariness. However, like in some specific scenarios, such as the slow onset processes, drought, desertification, or even sea level rise, this line becomes very blurry, right? People may move like preemptively before a crisis hit, which isn't exactly like a forced displacement, but it's not yet a fully voluntary decision. So that comes to what I was mentioning, that maybe we also need to recognize when we are studying climate-related human mobility, the continuum of mobility decisions, in which like climate change will influence both displacement and migration, the degree of choice, and the conditions under which people are moving. And that's what will differentiate what if it's displacement, migration, and so on. I hope it answers. Over.
Over to me as the third and final, continue with the pattern. Um, I completely agree with Diogo in that I think they have quite different legal terms, but also it's becoming more and more gray. But I leave that with the legal scholars, of which it's not me. But rather coming from like more of a social scientist background as well, I actually would not call it climate-induced displacement, right? Because also then that kind of implies a very environmental deterministic point of view that then kind of obscures some of the like different reasons for migration that we've highlighted, I think, in the panel today, whether it's also related to social reasons, economic reasons, etc. And so I think maybe it would be good to kind of avoid some of this induced language because it then kind of avoids a conversation, I think, of thinking about marginalization, longer term histories of like why certain people are moving and why certain people can't, etc., that I think are important to get into.
Really great responses. Thank you. And it's great that we're ending on this conversation of terminology. I think for as long as I've been working in this field, this question continues to come up. And that's why we continue to have these conversations about the terms that we use and in what context. So I appreciate the question from the audience member as well. So thank you so much to our panelists. Really, really interesting. I learned so much, not only about the places and the actual geography of where you've done your work, but also just I think the conversations really pushed the needle on some of the conceptual and theoretical conversations that are relevant to this topic. From Diogo, the habitability concept and what it means for a place to be socially habitable. And Claire, your discussion of justice and injustice and what that really means at the local level, from the macro to the micro level. So thank you to everyone. I think this was really interesting. I think we hope that you will join the rest of the sessions throughout the symposium. We have really three, because we're only at the beginning, three more pretty much full days of conversation on these topics. And I will leave it there and we can close out. So thank you and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.